The morning of my cousin's baptism arrived with the pale winter light spilling across the streets, the kind that made everything look softer than it really was. The air was crisp, scented faintly with fresh bread from the bakery down the block. I woke up earlier than I needed to, not because I was excited, but because some restless part of me knew this day wouldn't pass quietly. The night before, Clara, my cousin's wife, had called to confirm the time. "It'll be a special family moment," she'd said. Her voice was polite, but there was a tension under it, like a smile stretched too thin. I told her I'd be there. I didn't tell her I'd been debating whether to go at all. Still, I pulled out the navy blue dress I'd been saving for something respectable, slipped it on, and clasped the small silver chain around my neck. I had chosen my gift for baby Daniel weeks ago, a tiny silver pendant in the shape of an angel, small enough for a christening day, but meant to be kept until he was old enough to understand its meaning. A taxi took me to St. Luke's Church, an old building that seemed to hold its own gravity, pulling everyone in with its high stone walls and stained glass windows. The sun shone through the colored glass, scattering pieces of red, gold, and blue across the marble floor. It should have felt peaceful, but the moment I stepped inside, something in the air felt off. I entered through the side door, where the mingling scents of lilac and incense met me. The sound of voices echoed under the vaulted ceiling, family members greeting each other, children squealing as they ran between the pews, the mechanical click of phone cameras capturing every detail. My Aunt Helena stood near the altar, holding Daniel in his pristine white baptism gown, beaming as guests approached to coo over him. She spotted me from across the room. For a moment, her smile faltered so quickly that anyone else might have missed it. But I noticed. We hadn't spoken much since the dinner 2 months ago, when an argument over something small had turned into something personal. Still, she waved me over. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice warm but her eyes careful. "Of course," I replied, offering the small wrapped box. "This is for him." She nodded, but didn't open it. Instead, she handed Daniel to her husband, murmured something, and drifted toward the front of the church. I took a seat in the second pew on the left, smoothing my dress over my knees, pretending not to notice a few people glancing at me with that mix of curiosity and mild disapproval you can feel without hearing a word. I'd been coming to St. Luke's since I was a child. But things had changed in the past few months, ever since Father Michael had. Well, ever since the messages. He was standing near the altar now, speaking to the godparents. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that made people lower their voices when he walked past. He saw me. His eyes didn't linger, but they didn't need to. I knew the look. A bell rang softly, signaling the start of the ceremony. Everyone shuffled into their seats, voices fading into the echo of the organ's first notes. I tried to focus on Daniel, his tiny hands, the way he blinked against the light filtering through the glass, but my attention kept drifting to Father Michael. He began the service with his usual deep, resonant voice. Words about faith, family, and purity, words I had heard 100 times before. But then, without warning, he paused. His gaze swept the congregation and landed squarely on me. "Some people," he said, his tone slow and deliberate, "are not fit to be in this house of God." The words hit like a slap. A ripple went through the pew's small gasps, murmurs, a rustle of shifting bodies. My aunt's head turned sharply in my direction. I felt my face grow hot, my stomach tighten. My first instinct was to look away, to pretend he hadn't met me. But I knew, and so did everyone else. I kept my hands clasped in my lap, my nails pressing into my palms. I wanted to stand up right then. I wanted to say something, anything. But instead, I sat still, my mind spinning back to 2 weeks ago, to the late-night messages from Father Michael, that I had never asked for, the ones I had saved but never shown anyone, the ones that proved without question that he had no right to speak about who was fit to be anywhere. At the time, I hadn't been sure what to do with them. Now, as the baptism continued and his voice filled the church, I felt the decision start to take shape, and I knew deep down that this wasn't going to end quietly. The words still hung in the air, even as Father Michael moved on with the baptism. Prayers as if nothing had happened. I could feel the heat of stares from behind me, each pair of eyes a silent question. What did she do? Why is he talking about her? I kept my face neutral, my hands resting in my lap, my breathing steady, at least on the outside. Inside, my thoughts were ricocheting from one memory to the next, piecing together every interaction with him, every look, every comment I'd brushed aside. The godparents stepped forward, standing with Daniel's parents at the altar. Helena's smile was back in place, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her hands moved with practiced precision, adjusting the blanket, smoothing the lace on Daniel's gown, but her shoulders were tense, her gaze flicking toward me twice and less. Then a minute. From the pew in front of me, my cousin Clara half turned, as if to check whether I was still sitting there. When our eyes met, she quickly looked away. A few feet to my right, Mrs. Gibbons, the type of woman who ran the parish gossip mill, was already whispering to the lady beside her, their heads bent so close together they might as well have been sharing secrets over tea. I could almost hear the narrative forming, and once it started here, it wouldn't stop. In a place like St. Luke's, the only thing faster than forgiveness was rumor. The choir began a soft hymn as Father Michael prepared the baptismal font. His hands moved with ceremonial grace, yet I noticed how his shoulders squared slightly, as if standing taller for my benefit. He knew what he had just done, and he knew I wouldn't cause a scene, not here, not now. At least. That's what he thought. Helena stepped forward, holding Daniel in both arms. He was sleeping blissfully, unaware of the tension coiling in the air. Father Michael dipped his fingers into the water, murmuring the ancient words of blessing. As the ritual unfolded, I let my eyes wander across the congregation. My grandmother sat on the far left, her cane resting against her leg. She looked at me once, a long, steady look, then shifted her gaze to Father Michael with something sharp in her expression. Something that said she'd notice more than she was letting on. I swallowed hard. Gran had a way of seeing through people, a skill honed by decades of keeping family secrets and knowing exactly when to let them out. If anyone would understand what was really happening here, it was her. The organ played a final chord, and the ceremony paused for the congregation to pray. Everyone bowed their heads, everyone except me. I kept my eyes open, fixed on Father Michael, daring him, just daring him to meet my gaze. He didn't. Instead, he finished the blessing, marked Daniel's forehead with holy water, and announced, "Welcome, child of God, into our family." Applause rippled through the church, polite but restrained. The formal part of the service was over. People began shifting in their seats, ready for the procession outside where photographs would be taken. I stayed seated for a moment, letting the crowd move around me, watching the lines of people gather near the altar for their turn to greet Helena and the baby. Clara approached me, her smile brittle. "Thanks for coming," she said. "I know, things have been tense." "Tense?" I raised an eyebrow. "He just called me unfit to be here in front of the entire church." Her smile froze. She glanced over her shoulder, then back to Emmy. "Just don't make a scene, please, for Helena's sake." It was the kind of plea that wasn't really about Helena. It was about keeping the appearance of peace, even if it meant swallowing the truth. But I wasn't interested in swallowing anything today, not my pride. Not my anger, and certainly not my evidence. I didn't answer her. I simply rose from my seat and stepped into the aisle. From the corner of my eye, I saw Mrs. Gibbons watching me like a hawk, her lips already pursed as if storing up whatever she would say about me later. Outside, the winter sunlight was blinding after the dim glow of the church. Families clustered together for photos, laughter bubbling up as if nothing uncomfortable had happened inside. Children tugged at their parents' hands, eager to run off and play. Father Michael stood near the steps, greeting each person as they exited. I caught fragments of his words, blessings, well wishes, polite jokes. But when I reached him, his tone cooled. "Good to see you here," he said, the barest trace of a smirk touching his mouth. "I hope you've found your place." It was a warning wrapped in civility, and it landed exactly as he intended. He thought I would keep quiet because making noise would only make me look worse. I smiled, not the warm kind, but the kind that says you have no idea what's coming. "Don't worry," I said. "I'm right where I need to be." And for the first time since I'd stepped inside St. Luke's, I knew that was true. By the time the last of the photographs were taken outside the church, I'd managed to avoid most of the small talk. People were smiling for the camera, holding the baby, pretending that nothing awkward had happened in there. That was the thing about events like this. Appearances mattered more than truth. I lingered near the steps, pretending to check my phone, waiting for the crowd to thin. Helena had been pulled into yet another group photo, Clara at her side. "Father." Michael was still shaking hands at the far end of the walkway, laughing with someone as if his morning hadn't included publicly humiliating me. When the moment felt right, I slipped around to the side of the church. The cold air was sharper here, away from the chatter and the camera flashes. I leaned against the stone wall and opened my phone, not to scroll, but to remind myself exactly what I was holding. The messages were still there in the same neat little bubble threads as the night they'd arrived. "Father Michael, I think of you more often than I should. Father Michael, you have a way of making me distracted during service. Father Michael, you looked beautiful today." That dress was hard to forget. I remembered sitting in my apartment that night, staring at the screen, rereading each one to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. At first, I thought maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was a strange attempt at humor, but then came the last one. "Father Michael, if you ever want to talk privately, I can make that happen." That was when the cold, heavy feelings settled. And this wasn't a misunderstanding, and it wasn't something I could brush off as a clumsy compliment. He was a priest in a position of power, and he had crossed a line. I'd screenshotted every message, timestamp and all. I told no. One partly out of shock, partly because I knew how things worked in this parish. People didn't question Father Michael. They questioned you. I was still scrolling through them when I heard a voice behind me. "Careful out here, you'll freeze." I turned to see my grandmother wrapped in her thick brown coat, her cane, tapping softly against the pavement. She had a way of appearing without warning, like she'd always been standing just behind you, waiting for you to notice. "You slipped out quick," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "That thing you said, it was about you, wasn't it?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." Her gaze dropped to the phone in my hand. "And you have something on him." It wasn't a question. I glanced toward the corner of the church where the crowd still lingered. Messages from him. Things he shouldn't have said. Things I could show everyone. Gran's jaw tightened, the skin around her eyes creasing in a way that told me she was thinking fast. "If you're going to do it, you don't do it small. You do it where it can't be twisted, where every word is heard." I knew exactly what she meant. And I knew exactly where that place was, the same place he'd just shamed me. We stood there for a moment, the sound of distant laughter drifting from the front steps. My grandmother reached out and took my hand, squeezing it once. "You've got truth on your side. she said softly, but timing is everything. Her words followed me as we walked back toward the others. The reception was at the parish hall, a low brick building just behind the church. Inside, the smell of coffee and baked goods wrapped around us like a blanket. Though the warmth did little to ease the tightness in my chest, Helena and Clara were already seated at a long table with Daniel asleep in his carrier. I took a seat at the far end, half listening to the chatter around me. People talked about the weather, the baby's hair, the color of the baptism gown, anything but the tension that had settled like a shadow over the morning. Father Michael eventually came in, his laughter filling the room again. He moved from table to table, offering blessings, shaking hands. When he reached ours, he placed a hand on Helena's shoulder, then turned to me. "Still here?" he said lightly. I thought maybe you'd slipped away. "I'm not going anywhere," I replied. My voice was steady. Too steady. His eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second before the smile returned. "Good. We're all family here." Family. The word made my stomach turn. After the meal, people began to drift out in twos and threes. I stayed behind, helping Gran with her coat. She looked at me the way she always did when she was about to give advice that would stick. "Don't act." In anger, she said, "Act in certainty. And when you do, make sure everyone's looking." I nodded, tucking her words away like ammunition, because the truth was, I'd already made my decision. It wasn't a matter of if anymore. It was when. By Monday morning, I knew the whispers had started. Not because anyone had said anything directly to me, no. That's not how St. Luke's worked, but because of the way people looked. The sideways glances at the grocery store, the quick cutoff of conversations when I walked into the post office, the sudden brittle smiles that didn't reach the eyes. St. Luke's didn't need a newspaper. Its news traveled faster than any Prit could manage. At the cafe on Main Street, I overheard it firsthand. Two parish women were sitting at the corner table, their coffee cups steaming, their heads bowed together. I heard it was about her, one of them whispered. "Father Michael wouldn't just say that for no reason," the other replied. "I'm just saying she's always been different. Different." The word stuck in my ears. Not wrong, not guilty, just different. Which, in a place like this, was enough to be dangerous. That afternoon, I went through the messages again, not because I needed to check, but because I wanted to memorize every line, every timestamp. If I was going to do this, I had to be airtight. No room for doubt, no crack for him to slip through. I printed them, too. 4 full pages laid out in black and white. Seeing them on paper made them feel heavier, more solid. This wasn't just a phone screen that could be accused of editing or faking. This was evidence. I slid the pages into a plain manila envelope and tucked it into my desk drawer. My hand lingered on the handle before I shut it, as if I could already feel the moment they'd leave that drawer and change everything. On Wednesday, my grandmother called. "He's visiting Mrs. Callahan this week," she said, "helping her with some home repairs." "Since when does Father Michael do home repairs?" I asked. Grand silence was answer enough. "He's making his rounds," she said finally, "trying to keep everyone in his corner. If he feels the ground shifting, he's going to work twice as hard to control the story." It made sense. He'd been here for years. He knew exactly how to keep people loyal show up when they were sick, remember their kids' birthdays, help with bills when someone was short. Acts of kindness that also served as insurance. But I wasn't afraid of kindness. I was afraid of silence. On Friday, I got a message from Clara. "Clara, are you coming to the Sunday service? Helena thinks it would be good for you to show face." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Sunday service, the largest weekly gathering. Every pew full, everyone in the same room. I typed back, "Me, yes, I'll be there." It was decided. I didn't need to tell Clara why. The rest of the week was a strange mix of normal errands and constant calculation. I thought about where I'd sit, how I'd speak, how I'd hold the papers so they couldn't be dismissed as out of context. I even rehearsed the first few sentences in my head, not because I planned to read from a script, but because I wanted the opening to be uncheckable dot by Saturday night. I felt a kind of quiet settle over me. Not peace, exactly. More like the stillness before a storm breaks. I brewed tea, sat at my kitchen table, and opened the envelope one last time. The paper felt cool against my fingers. I imagined the sound it would make in the church when I unfolded. The sharp rip of silence that would follow. For the first time all week, I smiled. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted the truth out in the open, where even St. Luke's couldn't pretend not to see it. The morning of the service, I dressed in a deep burgundy coat, something that would stand out against the sea of dark winter colors. If people were going to remember this day, I wanted them to remember me clearly. When I arrived, the church steps were already crowded. Children ran up and down the stone railing. Parents tried to herd them toward the doors, and the choir's warm-up drifted faintly from inside. I slipped into the second pew on the left. Same as at the baptism. Father Michael was at the front, adjusting the microphone stand, his voice low as he spoke to the lector. He didn't look at me this time, but I knew he'd seen me. I didn't expect it to happen today. Not exactly. But as the organ began its opening chords, I felt the envelope under my coat, and the weight of it was enough to steady my hands. When the congregation rose for the first hymn, I sang every word, because if my grandmother was right, and she usually was, timing was everything. And my moment was coming. The first half of the service moved with its usual rhythm, scripture readings, hymns, the congregation sitting and standing in unison like the ebb and flow of a tide. I had been ready for the predictability. Predictability meant control, but control vanished the moment Father Michael stepped up to the pulpit for his homily. His tone was warm, almost casual, as he spoke about truth and integrity and living life without secrets. At first, I thought it was just another sermon. Then his words sharpened. Some people, he said, walk among us wearing masks. They present themselves as part of our family, but in reality, their hearts are turned toward selfishness and deceit. I felt my grandmother's hand on my arm. She was sitting beside me, her grip steady, her gaze fixed on him. This community, he continued, must be vigilant. We must protect ourselves from those who would poison the well. A low murmur moved through the congregation. He didn't name me. He didn't have to. I saw Mrs. Gibbons turn her head, just slightly in my direction, as if confirming the story she'd been telling all week. I could feel the envelope inside my coat pocket. My fingers itched to pull it out, to stand up and break the pattern of his voice filling the air. But my heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then I heard it quiet but clear. My grandmother's voice right next to me now. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. Before I could talk myself out of it, I stood. The creak of the pew drew eyes before I even spoke. My voice, when it came, felt strange in my mouth, stronger than I expected. Father Michael, I said, if you're going to talk about masks and deceit, maybe we should start with yours. The room went still. The choir stopped shifting in their seats. Even the children seemed to pause mid-fidget. He looked at me from the pulpit, his face neutral, but his eyes were sharp. I think you've misunderstood my point, he said, his voice still smooth. Perhaps this isn't the time. This is exactly the time, I cut in. My hand slipped into my coat, pulling out the manila envelope. I walked to the aisle, every step sounding louder than it should. When I reached the center, I turned to face the congregation. My voice didn't shake. These, I said, holding up the pages, are messages sent to me by the man standing at that pulpit. Messages no priest should ever send to anyone. A ripple went through the pew's gasps, whispers, the rustle of people leaning forward to see better. I unfolded the first page and read aloud. I think of you more often than I should. You have a way of making me distracted during service. You looked beautiful today. That dress was hard to forget. Each sentence landed like a stone in water, the sound of the words spreading wider with each ripple of silence. Father Michael stepped down from the pulpit, his voice rising. This is out of context fabricated. I didn't let him finish. Screenshots, time-stamped. You want to see them? I'll pass them around. I held the papers out toward the first pew where Mrs. Gibbons sat frozen, her mouth slightly open. Behind me, someone pulled out a phone. Then another. The soft click of cameras became a chain reaction. The quiet murmur of, "Get this?" spread faster than the sermon ever had. I came here today, I said, prepared to wait, to speak privately. But when you stand here and preach about deceit while hiding your own, you don't deserve privacy. The last word echoed. My hands were steady now. My heart was not. Father Michael stopped moving toward me. He glanced toward the back of the church, where 2 members of the parish council stood near the doors. One of them, Mr. Hanley, was already walking forward, his face grim. My grandmother's cane tapped once on the floor. Told you, she whispered. The councilman took the papers from me, scanned the first page, then the second. He looked up at Father Michael, his jaw tight. Father, he said, I think you need to step outside. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't uncertainty anymore. It was watching a shift happen in real time, the moment a leader's authority cracked in front of his followers. He left the church with the councilman. I stayed where I was, holding the last page in my hand. The words on it were shorter, but heavier than all the others combined. If you ever want to talk privately, I can make that happen. I folded the paper slowly, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it on the altar. Then I walked back to my pew, my grandmother's. Hand finding mine, she didn't say, "Good job," or "I'm proud of you." She just gave my hand a single firm squeeze. The rest of the service was canceled. The news spread faster than incense in a closed room. By Monday morning, the church parking lot felt different. Cars idled longer before people got out, as if drivers were debating whether they should even be here. The conversations that used to start with weather or family now began with, "Did you hear?" followed by a quick glance around to check for listening ears. Some called me brave, others called me a liar. There was no middle ground. At the grocery store, Mrs. Callahan stopped me in the produce aisle. "You shouldn't have done that in front of the children," she said, shaking her head. "In front of the children," I repeated, letting the words sink in. "Not he shouldn't have sent those messages." She didn't answer. She just picked up her apples and walked away. Clara texted that evening. "Clara, Helena's embarrassed. She wishes you'd kept it private." Me, I tried. He didn't. "Clara, you've made a lot of people uncomfortable." I stared at that last line. That was the point. The comfort had been his shield. The discomfort was my proof. By Wednesday, Father Michael's supporters had started their own quiet campaign. They called it context. They called it misinterpretation. One even suggested I had lured him into saying those things. I had expected denial. I hadn't expected the reach of his influence, but what they didn't know was that I hadn't shown all the messages. Not yet. It came Thursday night, just after 9. 3 short knocks. Not hesitant, but not aggressive either. When I opened the door, I found Mr. Hanley, the councilman who had taken the papers from me on Sunday. "Can I come in?" he asked. He sat at my kitchen table, folding his large hands together like he was praying. The council's meeting this week, he said. They want to hear everything, all the evidence. I nodded, slid the manila envelope across the table. This is most of it. Most? His eyebrow lifted. I went to my desk, unlocked the bottom drawer, and took out the smaller envelope, the one with the messages I hadn't read aloud. The ones that were more suggestive, less defensible, impossible to spin as harmless. Mr. Hanley. Read in silence. His expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened on the paper. We'll meet you at the meeting, he said finally, and there will be pushback. You should be ready for that. I've been ready since the baptism, I said. The parish council gathered in the church hall, the same room where we'd had coffee and cake for Daniel's baptism. The tables were arranged in a long rectangle, chairs filled with faces I'd known my whole life. Some nodded at me. Others didn't. Father Michael wasn't there. That alone shifted the air. Mr. Hanley opened the meeting, stating plainly, We are here to address a serious allegation against Father Michael. I told them everything. From the first message to the moment I read them aloud in front of the congregation. I laid the printed pages in the center of the table, one after another, like laying down cards in a game no one wanted to play. The questions came sharp and rehearsed. Could these have been fabricated? Did you ever give him reason to believe you welcome this attention? Why not come to us privately first? Each time, my answer was the same. You've all seen him stand in that pulpit. You know how he speaks about sin and purity. If I had come to you quietly, he would have turned it back on me, just like he tried to on Sunday. Silence followed that. A silence heavy enough to make them shift in their seats. Mr. Hanley finally sighed. The diocese will be informed. Until then, Father Michael is suspended from his duties. It was a win, but it didn't feel final. The backlash came quickly. Anonymous letters in my mailbox, written in careful script. One read, You've destroyed a good man's life. Another, You'll answer for this. Social media posts popped up, vague but pointed. Some people crave attention more than truth. A few old friends stopped returning my calls, but there were others, the quiet supporters. The woman who slipped a note into my hand at the pharmacy, he messaged me too. The teenager who lingered by my table at the cafe just long enough to whisper, Thank you. Their voices didn't drown out the anger, but they cut through it. And each time I heard them, I thought of what my grandmother had said about timing. 2 weeks later, the diocese issued its statement. They didn't name me. They didn't describe the messages. But they confirmed that Father Michael had engaged in inappropriate communication and would be relieved of his pastoral duties indefinitely. Some called it justice, some called it a tragedy. I called it an ending. On Sunday, I walked into St. Luke's for the first service without him. The air felt lighter. The sunlight through the stained glass seemed sharper, clearer. People still stared, but the looks had changed. Curiosity had given way to something else, not quite respect, not quite gratitude, but maybe the beginnings of both. After the service, I stayed behind. My grandmother stood with me in the empty nave, her cane tapping softly against the floor. You did it, she said. No, I corrected. The truth did. We walked out together, the winter air crisp on our faces. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was carrying something heavy. I'd left it behind right where it belonged. In the open,